Black Americans are the ancient Egyptians. Yes, yes indeed, Black Americans are the ancient Egyptians. Controversy surrounds Afro-Americans in ancient Egypt. Due to the spring 2023 Netflix movie in which the role of Cleopatra was played by a black woman, this movie and a new exhibit at the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, the Netherlands, called Kemet, Egypt in Hip-Hop, Jazz, Soul, and Funk, has caused much interest in the promotion of ancient Egypt as a black civilization. Yes, many people are upset. They're upset. They're upset because there's much evidence coming out now that Black Americans are the ancient Egyptians. Although officials in Egypt are attacking the idea that ancient Egypt was a black civilization, Afro-American artists have popularized this reality for over 100 years. Yes, yes. These artists and recent genetic, archaeological, and other assorted evidence suggest that Afro-Americans are the ancient Egyptians. The most admired and imitated people in the world due to their music, style, and charisma is the Afro-Americans. In this video, we will discuss evidence that the foundational Black Americans are the ancient Egyptians. The first controversy that upset the Egyptian government and other white nationalists was the idea that Netflix would make a movie called Cleopatra. This is not, in a sense, such an important thing, except for the fact that they made the audacious decision that, in a sense, they would cast a black woman as ancient Cleopatra. Oh, wow, this upset many people. It upset the Egyptian government, because Egypt accused Netflix of misrepresenting history by casting a black woman to play Cleopatra, its most famous historical figure. In this new Netflix series that began on May 5th, 2023, people were excited about it, but although there were many people excited about it, couldn't wait to see it, wanted to see how could Cleopatra have been black. Over 60,000 people, though, had signed a petition which called for the cancellation of the show due to the star playing Cleopatra was black. Yes, yes, 60,000 people wrote a petition to try to stop Netflix from showing the film, but they showed it anyway, and people loved it, people enjoyed it, people were so happy to see it, except for the people in ancient Egypt. Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquity said that the documentary requires those, and I quote, in charge of its production to investigate accuracy and rely on historical and scientific facts. Dr. Mustafa Waziri, Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquity, said that making Cleopatra black was a falsification of Egyptian history and a blatant historical fallacy. That's what Dr. Mustafa Waziri said. He added that, far from any ethnic racism, stretching full respect for African civilizations and for our brothers in the African continent that brings us all together. This was crazy. This is crazy. He's talking about the African continent. Egypt is in Africa. Where does he think it is? Egypt is in Africa. But let's continue. Egyptians did not bear the features of the sub-Saharan Africans, said Dr. Samia El-Magrani, former Director General of the Center for Research and Conservation of Antiquities. Citing evidence from anthropological studies and DNA tests, he said would prove this, but it doesn't prove that. We know that the Macedonians, their DNA shows that they, in a sense, had sub-Saharan African DNA. And since Cleopatra was, in a sense, of Macedonian origin, plus, the Egyptians had lived in Egypt, and they had made it with the Egyptians over a long period of time. So we know that even during Cleopatra VII's time, now she was black, so that's all bull. And yet the Egyptians, they were upset because they felt that in showing this black woman as Cleopatra, that Netflix was doing something wrong. Another thing that's controversial, another thing that has many Egyptians upset, is a new exhibit at the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, the Netherlands. In this exhibit in Leiden, in the Netherlands, is called Kemet, Egypt in Hip-Hop, Jazz, Soul, and Funk. This creative exhibit illustrates how black artists have used ancient Africa, especially ancient Egypt, as an expression of their spirituality, pride, and power, yes. You know, even going back during the jazz time, you know, that people talked about Egypt. They talked about the fact that the Egyptians were black. And they base this on the fact that even the Bible tells you that Ham was black, and if Ham was black, then the Egyptians had to be black. But many people are butthurt. Yes, they're butthurt. They're upset because of the fact, in the sense that black people would declare, in a sense, that Egypt was black, and that these organizations like Netflix or the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden in the Netherlands would dare even imply that the ancient Egyptians were black. To demonstrate the relationship of the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, they made a bust of Tutankhamun. And what they did, though, is that they made this bust of Tutankhamun to look like a foundational black American. Yes, to look black. Oh, wow, this upset a lot of people. The National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden has been criticized by the Egyptian government for portraying Tutankhamun as black. This was reported in the Egyptian Independent newspaper. The Independent newspaper reported that members of Egypt's House of Representatives alleged that representing a black man as Tutankhamun was cultural appropriation. An Egyptian antiquities expert, Abdelrahim Rahan, has also criticized the project. Yes, they're upset. But Wim Wejan, the director of the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, Netherlands, says, and I quote, "The exhibition does not have an Afrocentric perspective on ancient Egypt, but critically talks about some ideas presented in the music." Yes, the music of foundational black Americans, the music that sets the tenor of the world, the music that everyone looks for and everyone wants to hear, comes from black America, made by foundational black Americans. Wim Wejan added that, for example, and I quote, "The exhibition explains that the word Kemet refers to the black fertile soil along the Nile, not the skin color, and that there is no truth in the conspiracy theory that the noses of statues were cut off in modern times to hide presumed African features." That's Wim's perspective, but we know that just about every statue that you find that refers to an ancient Egyptian, when you look at these statues, I'm sorry to say, the noses are cut off. There's no way up the noses would break off because they're flat. They're not pointed like European noses, so they had to break them to get rid of those noses. But now, in a sense, we have a lot of information, DNA, archaeological evidence, iconographic evidence. We have these statues and DNA that show that the ancient Egyptians were black. Not only that the ancient Egyptians are black, but that many of these ancient Egyptians, yes, many of these ancient Egyptians look like foundational black Americans we see today. Now we also have DNA evidence about the African Americans being Egyptians. And this comes from 23andMe. 23andMe has shown that Egyptian pharaoh Ramses III is a match with a guy in Atlanta called Dexter Caffey. The exact one. And what makes it even more interesting is that Dexter Caffey looks like Ramses III. Wow. In addition, there is a bust at the Chicago Film Museum that appears to look like Michael Jackson. Yes, yes. This and other evidence makes it clear that that it's obvious foundational black Americans are the ancient Egyptians. And that when people talk about The ancient Egyptians being black, they're not lying, they're telling the truth. So I want you to enjoy this film that's about to also play. But always remember, it is obvious, foundational black Americans are the ancient Egyptians. We are the ancient Egyptians. Don't think about it, just do it. When my children were little, my wife and I would take them to visit the Field Museum in Chicago. I loved to visit the Mesoamerican section and the ancient Egyptian exhibit. The Field Museum had a very fine Egyptian collection. They had Egyptian mummies and artifacts relating to all the major periods. I always found it interesting that when we were in the Egyptian exhibit, the non-Afro-Americans visiting the exhibit would sheepishly look at the exhibits and then stare at me and my children. It was interesting because it appeared that the non-Afro-American visitors, after staring at us, had a depressed look on their face, as they left the exhibit. Back in the day, I didn't understand why non-Afro-Americans might be depressed after seeing the exhibit while we were inside the exhibit. Many years later, I thought about this phenomenon, but I didn't understand this until I read the work of Diop and did comparative historical linguistics to reconstruct the paleo-history of Afro-Americans and West Africans. As a result of my research, I learned that ancient Egypt was a pan-African civilization, and that many nomes in ancient Egypt were inhabited by various West African tribes. Diop proved that these tribes, after the fall of ancient Egypt, migrated into West Africa. This truth was supported by the presence of West Africans practicing aspects of Egyptian civilization, and they spoke languages genetically related to the ancient Egyptian language. This finding led to an epiphany. I finally understood why non-Afro-Americans looked at us strange in the exhibit at the Field Museum in Chicago. They were looking at us strange because they intuitively understood that we Afro-Americans looked just like the Egyptians. What made my research into Diop interesting is because he proved that West Africans, like the Mandi, Fulani, and Wolof, formerly lived in ancient Egypt. This was a powerful discovery because these are the same slaves sold in America during the Atlantic slave trade. Wow, I thought. Afro-Americans did not only look like the ancient Egyptians, our ancestors were the ancient Egyptians. And now, due to the research of Diop, I could prove it. I'm happy today. I discovered the work of Diop and that our Afro-American African ancestors were the ancient Egyptians. This proved that you should not just think about your history. Just do some research and find out the truth.